And welcome to the International News Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Subscribe to our channel to stay in the loop on all of the international affairs occurring around us today. Now let's get right into our story today, which concerns Africa and diplomacy. More specifically, U.S. diplomacy and influence in the region, and its competitiveness and attempt to counterbalance China in the continent. Now, as most of you that follow international politics are aware of, the United States and China have been in a bit of what some people would call a Cold War, what others would at least call a conflict of interest. Now, the reality is for the last 20 to 30 years, the United States has been the one primarily dominant country in the world, the hegemon, both militarily speaking, politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, socially speaking, with its influence of Hollywood, etc. America, the United States, has been the world's most dominant country. Whether or not you agree with different political leanings or whether you support the United States, that is just a fact. But China, in these last 20 to 30 years, has been growing economically, militarily, socially, pretty much in every form of life. China is a superpower. And when there are multiple superpowers in the world, what they do is they compete to be the most powerful, to be the world's hegemon. Now, countries do this. Even if they aren't a superpower, even in regions, every nation competes to be the most regionally dominant country in their area. But when a country is so powerful that it can be a global hegemon, it's going to compete with other superpowers to take its place. And China, as it grows, has ambitions to be the most influential, powerful, and not authoritarian, but most authoritative country in the world. It wants to dethrone the United States from its position. Now, both nations are actually more or less equal in terms of their influence today. The United States is still slightly more powerful, having a lot of Western allies, Western backing, being more powerful in the United Nations, and still having a stronger economy than China. Nonetheless, China is nipping at the US's heels, and it's very close. It's a photo finish race. Now, while the United States has been expanding its interests in Europe, in Asia, and the Middle East, China has been focusing on one continent that tends to be overlooked by many other countries: Africa. Africa has grown, Africa has developed, and Africa has a lot of countries that have massive populations, major resources, really great military capabilities, and are just great allies to have, great partners to have. And in the last 10 years specifically, China has been investing billions of dollars and a lot of its time and effort into developing Africa. Now, these Chinese developments, investments, and aid that it has provided to these countries have not been done because China cares about Africa. It does care about Africa, but it cares about Africa in a sense that it wants to use Africa. Some people would even say exploit Africa. Now, the United States wants to do the same thing. I use the word exploit, but any country that is trying to provide foreign aid or help another nation, whether it's in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, is doing it because it wants to exploit that country to carry out its own national interest. Now, China has been investing billions in education, in schools, in infrastructure, in economies of smaller African and larger African nations. China has created a lot of constructive partnerships and allies in the region. Now, the United States in the last 10 years has had different priorities foreign policy-wise. It has been focusing on, as I mentioned, in Latin America, primarily in the Middle East, Asia, and Europe. But this is something that the Joe Biden administration of the US wants to change. And Anthony Blinken is going to now, this Wednesday, go on a tour of Africa to kind of present the U.S. State Department's and the United States' new foreign policy towards Africa, which is an attempt to increase its influence and overmatch and overpower China in the continent. Now, as the U.S. State Department has stated, their goal is to create African partnerships, to create African solutions for African problems. Now, the reality is that the United States, despite having different regional priorities over the last 10 years, has not been completely absent from Africa. The US is still, for many countries in the continent, one of the largest foreign aid providers. In addition to this, the US has been one of the most major, I think actually the most major donor of COVID-19 vaccines, and it has also helped eradicate many diseases, old diseases in the African continent, making the people much more healthier. And again, the United States, just like China, is not doing these things because they care about the interests of the African people. They are doing this to create good faith, to create debt, and to kind of pressure or force, in a nice way, African countries to partner with the United States to ensure that American national interests can be secured in the continent and the region. And that national interest is to counterbalance China. So this report is going to focus exactly on how the United States is going to make its comeback in Africa, if we want to call it that. Now, Anthony Blinken's tour of Africa is going to focus on 3 major countries: Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal. 1 major country in Eastern Africa, 1 major country in Central and Western Africa, and 1 major country in Western Africa. Anthony Blinken wants to create partnerships in these 3 and other countries, but these 3 are currently the priority. Now, the main goal is to present to the African continent that America is back. And while there are a lot of aspects to these propositions and to the diplomatic process and plans that America has to increase its influence in the region, the most urgent aspect of this foreign policy mission is to solve 2 of Africa's most major crises. Primarily, the war in Ethiopia, the Tigray war, which we have covered extensively on this podcast, and the Sudanese military coup that occurred last month, which we have also covered on this podcast. And these are 2 really major and difficult issues to fix. However, for the United States, they present an opportunity to present themselves, America, as a country that can solve Africa's problems, be a voice of peace, be a voice of reason, and be a voice of democracy. Now, the United States wants to differentiate itself from China, and it is trying to find like-minded democratic partners. Now, democracy isn't really the most important thing here. The United States always said it's spreading democracy, but the reality is it's just trying to increase its foreign interest and its foreign capabilities. Now, in the past few months, the United States has actually made some attempts to solve these 2 major crises. And I want to focus on Ethiopia and Sudan for a quick moment before we move on to America's other ambitions in the continent. Now, recently, there have been many U.S. special envoys and U.S. diplomats that have visited Ethiopia and spoken to people on the side of the Ethiopian government, primarily Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and the Tigrayan forces, which are at a civil war with each other. Now, this conflict is really ugly. I have covered it in extensive detail, and if you're curious, and I hope you are, please go to our Africa playlist and you will find countless videos on exactly what's going on there today. My video from yesterday actually covered the human cost of the war. This conflict, which started out as a political one, has turned into an ethnic one, and it is extremely ugly, and it's threatening many other neighboring countries in the Eastern African region. Ethiopia is Africa's 2nd most populated country. It has around 120 million people. And if this war escalates, it will cause a major refugee crisis. If the United States can provide diplomatic pressure to solve this issue, it will create a lot of good faith in the Horn of Africa, in Eastern Africa, and pretty much the entire African Union. But the United States has tried to solve this conflict, and more specifically, it has tried really, really hard to at least create a ceasefire for both sides to just stop fighting, for the Ethiopian government to stop creating and initiating airstrikes in the blockaded Tigray region, and for Tigrayan forces and their allies, known as the United Front, to stop marching towards the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. These efforts have been fruitless. They have not been successful. Now, these efforts so far have been diplomatic, but the United States has now began to use an old weapon of theirs, sanctions. The US, when it wants to influence a country, doesn't necessarily have to bomb the shit out of it or send boots on the ground. There are different, more diplomatic, and more economic measures that can be just as damaging. The United States has recently removed Ethiopia from a US-Africa trade deal, which is going to hurt Ethiopia's economy. In addition to this, the United States has specifically introduced sanctions against military leaders in Eritrea, which has allied with the Ethiopian government against Tigrayan forces. Now, the United States has stopped short of sanctioning Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who, by the way, is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I've mentioned that countless times. They've stopped short of it, but it's on the table and they're willing to do it. Now, these sanctions have actually not been effective. The Ethiopian government has called this a provocation and has said that the United States is meddling in a domestic issue. So far, US attempts to calm down the conflict in Ethiopia have not worked. But Anthony Blinken's first visit in Africa to Kenya is going to be with Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta. And Kenya is an important country. One, because it has a lot of military capabilities. Two, because it borders both Ethiopia and Sudan, countries that are the two most problematic nations in Africa right now. And three, because Kenya is right now currently a sitting member of the UN Security Council. Now, Blinken is going to try and create new strategies with President Uhuru Kenyatta on how to create a ceasefire. That is the United States goal, to create a ceasefire in the Ethiopian war. The U.S. has stopped short of taking a side, whether it supports the TPLF and the Tigrayan Front and their allies, or whether it supports the Ethiopian government. But it has shown that it's willing to create sanctions on the Ethiopian government. Will this work? So far, it hasn't. And I'm going to be completely honest. It probably won't. The Ethiopian conflict is a domestic one. It is not one that was provoked by international interests or international meddling or an attempt to dissolve Ethiopia. It's a domestic issue. Now, it's a really bad issue and a lot of people are dying, and I personally hope that that war ends. But the United States is going to have to be a lot more dynamic in its approach if it wants to even attempt to create a ceasefire and bring both sides and both parties to the negotiation table. Now, I can't go into too much detail about Ethiopia. I would love to give a lot more details, but we have to move on for the sake of time. The second major issue that is concerning the United States is the military coup in Sudan. Last month, General Abdel Fattah Burhan overthrew Mohamed Hamdok, who is the civilian prime minister of Sudan. Now, Mohamed Hamdok was not democratically elected. He was appointed in what was called a sovereign council. This sovereign council was a form of government sharing. Half of the power laid in the hands of the military and the other half laid in the hands of a civilian government. Now, the military decided to overthrow the civilian government. Now, after this overthrow, which was directed by General Abdel Fattah Burhan, Burhan created himself as the chairman of the Sovereign Council, the de facto dictator, if you will, of Sudan. And that's really problematic for the United States and the West because before the civilian shared government in 2008, before it was created in 2018, when Mohamed Hamdok became the prime minister of the civilian government in Sudan, Sudan was ruled by a complete military junta, a military dictatorship. And this military dictatorship in Sudan was a complete global pariah. It was on the United States list of state sponsors of terrorism, meaning that it could not have trade. It had crippling sanctions, and Sudan was essentially dead to the international community. Now, after the civilian shared government with the military was created, Sudan lost its pariah status and actually began to interact with the global community, increasing trade, leading the country to a democratization process, and becoming a more agreeable country to the West. Now, a military takeover has set Sudan back significantly, at least in the eyes of the United States, and it has lost Sudan as a potential partner. Now, the United States has not taken extremely heavy action against the government of General Burhan. However, they have suspended $700 million of foreign aid to the country. But that's also probably not going to be effective. The reality is, Sudan has another potential partner. Countries no longer need the United States to survive. They no longer need the West to survive. When you can't look west, you just look east. And east, you have China. And in addition to this, Burhan, while having a good relationship with Chinese leaders, also has amazing relationships with Gulf leaders, with very influential Middle Eastern leaders. So this kind of approach, sanctioning the government, is not going to be effective. So the United States, for both Ethiopia and Sudan, is going to have to create a much more dynamic plan if it hopes to show itself as a partner for solving Africa's most serious issues. Now, again, I'm not going to go into detail of what's going on in Sudan and Ethiopia anymore. I want to focus the rest of this episode on what the rest of the United States proposals and foreign policy plan for its reemergence in the African continent is. After Anthony Blinken is finished with his visit to Kenya, which is primarily focused on solving the issues in Ethiopia and Sudan, he is going to visit Nigeria. And during this visit in Nigeria, Anthony Blinken is going to attempt to, with the Nigerian government, address many different Islamic militant insurgencies that have been occurring in Western Africa. Now, these Islamist militant insurgencies are not as threatening and they are not as urgent as what's going on in Sudan and Ethiopia. However, they can potentially become worse, lead to all-out civil wars, and lead to governments being overthrown. Now, this issue is actually something the United States could potentially help African countries solve and help African countries stay in power. And that is in their interest, to maintain peace and stability and their own power, these African leaders, especially those in Nigeria, in the region. Now, finally, after addressing the concerns of Islamic militant insurgencies in Western Africa, Blinken is finally going to visit Senegal. And in Senegal, Blinken is going to present the economic and sustainability aspect of the Biden administration's plan for its foreign policy in the African continent. More specifically, focusing on cooperation on climate change, sustainable development, job growth, and economic growth. Now, this area specifically is something the United States can be very successful in. And the reason I say this is because this area specifically is something China has been very successful in. And this is soft power diplomacy. You know, to be the most powerful country or to exert influence on a smaller nation, you don't have to bomb them. You don't have to send your military and overtake or overthrow the government. You can just simply help them grow and develop, give them loans, put them in debt, but make them your friend. When you give people a better life, the people look at you in a better way. The government lives better off of you. But also, if you provide loans, they're indebted to you and they have to pay these loans back. And if it ever occurs that they cannot pay these loans back, you just say, well, that's fine. You don't have to pay it back, but we just need you to change this law. We just need you to invade this country. We just need you to let us put a military base here. And China has been much more successful in this soft power diplomacy in the last 10 years than the United States has. Now, it's very clear that under the Biden administration, America wants to take a soft power approach, and that's for two reasons. Domestically, the American people are sick of being militarily involved in other countries' problems. And it's hard to explain to 350 million people who don't follow global politics every day on why we should be sending American troops who are aged between 18 to 19 and 22 years old to go die in some African country or some Middle Eastern country. It's much more effective domestically to present a policy of helping other countries progress and develop. And it's much more effective internationally to be the friendly, helpful, economic guide than the strong, hard military fist that is invading countries. And the United States is going to have to work on that reputation. While in America, in schools, and I'm American, we learn that we invade countries and that we went to Iraq, we went to Afghanistan, we went to Vietnam, we went to Korea to fight communism, fight dictatorships, and spread democracy. The reality is America did all of this to spread its own influence. And that is not a bad thing for any country. The United States naturally wants to spread its influence. China naturally wants to spread its own influence, and every country has a right to do so. But we live in much more modern times where things cannot be taken care of militarily, and a soft power approach is going to have to happen. So I want to end this report by saying that the African continent is going to be an extremely fascinating one to follow in the next 10 to 20 years. Africa is going to be faced by soft power diplomacy coming both from the United States and from China. Now, neither the US or China want the best for Africa. Now they do, they want Africa to grow, they want Africa to develop, but the reason that they want this is because they want to exert their own foreign policy and national interest, both the US and China. Now, African countries are in a really good position to take advantage of both sides. Take the goddamn money, use it on both sides, but be very smart on who you make deals with. Now, I'm not going to tell or say what's best for any African country or what's best for the African people. That's for African countries, African people in their respective countries to decide and their leaders to decide. But let me know what you think. Do you think that the United States reemergence in Africa and stating that America is back is going to be effective for spreading American interests? Do you think it's going to be good for African countries? Do you think that China's influence that is exerted in the region has been good for African countries? Do you think that African nations should just ignore both the United States and China and focus on a more independent path? What do you think is best for different African countries? Kenya, Nigeria, Senegal, Ethiopia, Sudan, whatever country. What do you think is best for them? Let me know in the comments. I really like when you guys comment. I like having a constructive conversation. I like having a debate. I even like when you insult me. It really, really gets the conversation going. And these are issues that more attention needs to be brought to and more conversation needs to be had. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you.